I am going to establish something greater than myself, and I'm going to do it in a very concerted fashion that stops me from being the center of attention.
Hello, I'm Shirley Kavanagh, and you're very welcome to the Leadership Discoveries podcast, where leaders and experts from across sectors share insights, turning points, and hard-won wisdom that can drive real leadership impact. And this is a very special episode. It's the 30th episode of Leadership Discoveries, and I'm delighted to welcome back Dean McAlister, Executive Vice President at Inizio Biotech, where he leads global biotech enterprise solutions, working across the business to support emerging biotech organisations as they navigate the complexity of bringing innovation to market. Now, Dean has spent close to 4 decades in the pharmaceutical and healthcare sector. Before Inizio, he was with AstraZeneca, where his career spanned 16 roles, including sales, training, market research, marketing, market access, and in a US executive leadership capacity. Now, Dean and I have talked before on this podcast about topics such as conscious competence, reflection, and the discipline of turning insight into action. And I recommend that you check out those episodes, as they are definitely worth a listen. But back to today. Dean's book, How to Matter Forever, I love the title, is due at the end of the year, and it explores leadership, legacy, influence, and what endures beyond a role. And I'm really looking forward to hearing more about that. But Dean, welcome back to Leadership Discoveries. You were my very first guest, and I'm delighted that you could join me here today for this 30th episode.
Thank you. It's an honor to be on the podcast, and having been the first, I'm very happy to be here for episode 30.
If we were married, Dean, which we're not, we'd actually be celebrating this would be our pearl anniversary, actually. So there you go. A little bit of trivia there for people. Anyway, let's talk about you and what has been happening. This is the third time you've been on my podcast, just as a reminder to people. And I know that I always get lots of really positive responses when I have you on the podcast. But what has shifted or sharpened your own thinking about leadership since we last spoke?
Well, the biggest shift for me is that I've become less interested in what leaders know and more interested in what happens around them. Earlier in my career, as you referenced, I probably put too much value on the leader having to have the answer. But after nearly 4 decades of watching organizations and leaders, I think the better test is, do people think better because I'm in the room as the leader? Do they speak more candidly? Do decisions get made? And are other leaders becoming more capable because I'm in the room? So that's really sharpened my definition of leadership considerably. Leadership really isn't just the accumulation of dependence on you. It's the creation of capability around you and ultimately independence beyond you. So I would tie it back to that the ultimate measure of leadership isn't how indispensable you actually become. It's what remains possible when you're no longer there, which really opens the door then to how to matter forever, because you want to matter forever and you can't be in the room forever, but yet you want to have established things that are sustainable beyond you.
Dean, have you become more reflective? I'm just wondering, as you're sort of at this point of your career, do you think, is there more about, I think once you talked about passing the baton to people behind you, like, are you finding yourself in that sort of more reflective space?
Reflective, but yet still active. I've
Hmm.
watched people that have been senior to me grow reflective and just end up giving opinions on things that don't end up having actions tied to them. So, yes, reflective, but reflective with still a bias for action, I guess is the
Hmm.
way I would look at it. But I do look at this idea of handing the baton as a very relevant example. All of us are running races in our current jobs, whether you're 25 and just getting started, or whether you're 60 like I am and coming closer to the end than even the middle anymore. And you're going to hand that baton to somebody else, or else the race is never going to be finished. And, if I've been the first runner in a race, in our analogy, I'm handing it to someone else. They have a different function maybe than I've had. The second relay runner has a different remit. and it
Hmm.
won't necessarily be what I've had. So I don't need to control that. I just need to make sure that that handoff is well done and that that second runner is equipped for the leg of the race that he or she needs to run.
And do you think, Dean, as you progress through your career, that that sense of passing on that baton became more obvious? Because that is essentially about developing talent and essentially about building successors. Do you think you did that earlier in your career, if you know what I mean? Or did that come through experience or necessity?
Came through both experience and necessity. I think earlier in my career, I would characterize myself of having been unconsciously competent, where I was functional. And certainly when there was a need for succession planning or handing the baton off to the next person, it was done. But it wasn't necessarily done with conscious competence, where there was intentionality and there was planning and there was forethought that went into it. None of those things happened to any degree of regularity. It was just almost the tyranny of the urgent of, I'm on to the next thing. Here you go. Let me know if you need anything. Well, that's not the way to handle that. So as I've grown older, I've realized that what leaders need to create is an environment sustainable beyond themselves. And that requires a very conscious competence
Hmm.
approach.
And there is a sense that one thing I do want to talk to you about is judgment. And one could assume that as we get older, get more experience, get more wisdom, we exercise better judgment. And I know you've recently written about judgment as being one of the most consequential but least rigorously defined words in leadership. So when you say someone has good judgment, what are you looking for? Particularly those people you might be looking for as successors or people developing.
Sure. The context for this, I think, is important. What I was thinking about whenever I was writing that section of the content that will be in How to Matter Forever about judgment was the experience base I had from the years of talent management reviews at
Mm.
AstraZeneca. When I was a leader, span break leader of up to 1,100 people, we would have the next level leader under us reviewed regularly for talent purposes. And one of the recurring comments as leaders got together in this tribal council to speak about what was going to happen to this talent would be statements like, he or she has good judgment. And
Hmm.
people would just shake their head. And you go, hmm. So now, upon reflection, years later, you look and say, well, what was really meant by that? And it was never
Hmm.
actually defined. So part of this rubric of a good baton handoff is to have good definitions. Well, the definition that I use for judgment is the ability to make a consequential choice when the available information cannot make the choice for you. So it's very important to think about it in that context. If the data makes the answer obvious, you don't need much judgment. Judgment becomes valuable precisely when the information is incomplete, when the
Hmm.
consequences matter, and reasonable people could actually reach different conclusions. And there's aspects of judgment that I put across kind of five arcs to think about. Knowing when not to intervene would be the first one of those, much like the Hippocratic Oath of first do no harm. Well, sometimes an intervention is not necessary. That's point one. Point two is separating urgency from importance. Not everything carries the same weight and burning platform. Third is recognizing patterns early. I think that's a tenet of good judgment, that you're able to see that and start to see something emerging before it might be obvious to everyone. Saying no to distractions, no matter how attractive they are. I see this a lot now with my work with emerging biotech companies where they have a platform perhaps that could work across multiple types of assets and therapeutic areas. And it almost becomes short attention span theater where they go like, hey, we could go into neurology. Well, hey, we could go into oncology. And all of those are attractive distractions, but somebody has to put an order to it, put a magnitude to it. We often help them with that type of decision rubric here at Inizio. But you have to be able to say no to something that might be very, very attractive. The strategy is choosing what you're not going to do also. And then the fifth and final point in this bit is understanding that every yes has an invisible cost. So, as a leader considers having good judgment, I think you have to look across these five things and say, well, hey, experience is going to give you a library. Judgment will determine which book you pull off the shelf at what time.
When you were saying those five things, I actually was just writing them down actually, and I was trying to think: is any one of these more important than the other? And I'm not sure it is because they're all interlinked. I mean, when you were talking about, being able to say no to distractions, because isn't that one of the problems with organizations, particularly with lots of lovely, shiny new technology? It's yes, 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 instead of actually taking the step back and saying, well, hang on a second, what are we actually trying to achieve? So, are all these five conditions, let's call them, in your view, are they all interconnected?
They're all interconnected, but they're not all needed at the same time. And that's where
Right.
experience comes into judgment because experience doesn't automatically produce judgment. Some people have 30 years of experience, others have 1 year of experience repeated 30 times. And there's a difference between the two, and you definitely want the former with 30 years of experience. It says, which one of these five cards do I need to play at the moment?
Yeah.
And then in what sequence perhaps to play others. That's where experience comes in, and that's what I mean by good judgment.
You mentioned as well, I think it was the second or third when you were talking about trends, sort of knowing what's actually happening. I think was the phrase, or, being able to spot what's actually happening and getting the information that you need when you don't have the information, because we're in a very complex world at the moment and we don't have maybe as much certainty or, sort of even information that maybe we would like to have. So what do you do in that situation where you've incomplete information, competing priorities, multiple stakeholders, and there's no obvious right answer? How do you get to the best answer?
Well, we all find ourselves in situations that we have to make a sound call. I would
Hmm.
phrase it when certainty isn't available, but this is where judgment and decision velocity and systems thinking really all converge. So perhaps it's a three-part framework where you know, you infer, and you decide. And first, you have to separate what I know from what I believe. Leaders get into trouble when assumptions quietly become facts.
Hmm.
And that can happen very subtly to any one of us. Second, you have to determine what I can reasonably infer from patterns, experience, and the system around the decision. And then third, you have to say, is additional information actually likely to change the decision? And if
Yeah.
it isn't, then decide, because some things are reversible. So if it's a reversible point, we sometimes apply irreversible decision rigor to decisions that can easily change. I often say there are no pharmaceutical emergencies. Some things you start very long cycle, like we're going to build a plant. Well, when you're halfway through building a plant, you can't come in and go like, hey, maybe we want to put that somewhere else. But a lot of other things, most other things, gives you a chance to evaluate what type of decision velocity that it might need. Because the goal isn't perfect decisions, it's high quality decisions at the speed the situation requires. And there's probably an analogy here of a rowing metaphor. So a crew rowing six perfectly synchronized strokes a minute will lose to a crew rowing 30 good ones. Organizations can become so obsessed with eliminating decision risk that they create a much larger risk, which is
Hmm.
inertia, and they get paralyzed at that point. So I would never really let a good outcome get in the way of some great process that we want to create. Because sometimes threshold, surely, is enough. You just need to get the organization moving, and you can't worry continually about having one more bit of information.
Yeah. And I'm really interested in what you're just saying there, all of that, because it is about decision making. And in my own practice, that's one of the things I come across a lot, where senior teams do get paralyzed, decide not to make a decision often. So they'll have the conversation and then decide not to make, almost agree to disagree. So taking all that you've actually said, and I know you talk about dissent and constructive dissent. Can you talk us a little bit more about that? Because that's really essential, isn't it, for coming up with the right decisions?
Yeah, you need to have this. And of course, the key thing that a lot of people point back to on constructive dissent is the great book on Team of Rivals, which talked about the Lincoln administration. His first administration as the US president back in 1860 and 1861, he actually brought people into his cabinet that had run against him for
Mm,
president. And he had those people around him because he knew he needed to have those points of view. And he was also bright enough that he thought, I need to bring some of these people who dissented with me inside the same tent, metaphorically, that I'm in. And he
hmm
did that, I think, in a brilliant fashion. But I think this point about constructive dissent is important. I look at it as the leader, perhaps the senior most leader in a room where you want to have constructive dissent. You have to watch for when your opinion becomes a prediction. Because if I speak too soon as the senior most leader, my opinion will likely become a prediction. And instead, you should say, well, hey, good judgment here needs some friction. So perhaps one of the most dangerous things that can happen as leaders accumulate authority is that their opinions begin to sound like predictions. And you speak declaratively to say, well, I think we should do X. What does everybody else think? Well, people aren't necessarily hearing a request for input. They may be hearing a prediction of the answer I'm expecting.
mm.
And I would say that's really a false enrollment for the leader. I call one version that false enrollment. I've effectively made the decision, and then I've invited everyone else to participate in validating my decision. And you feel like because silence comes in the room after that, that's evidence of agreement. But that's not the case. Sometimes silence is simply a rational calculation because the other leaders that often either are subordinate to you or somehow under you in the organization, if it's a cross-functional team, they ask questions like, well, how strongly does the leader believe this? What happens if I challenge it? Will anything actually change? Is this worth the political capital that I would have to expend in order to get some dissent in this room? In other words, is the juice worth the squeeze? And most of the time, no, it's not, because authority creates an obligation to manufacture permission for dissent. And the way to do it, the senior more that you are in the situation, you can't speak too early. You
Yeah,
can't speak
yeah.
declaratively because you're declaring something into existence and you're missing the opportunity to actually get that friction that Lincoln was trying to cause by having the team of rivals close to him. But he couldn't come into that by starting out saying, you know, I beat all of you in the election and I've got an idea. That's not the way that he was going to engage people to feel comfortable because there has to be a safety net around people that A, you haven't decided already, and B, you're not going to take it out on them for expressing something that's a different opinion.
And you know, Dean, that requires quite sophisticated leadership, doesn't it?
It does, and some of that comes from the judgment criterion we've laid out, and
Mm,
honestly, some of it comes from the school of hard knocks, which you collect over time. So often, what we're talking about here is it would be incredibly rare to find a leader that could operate in the manner we've just described through these first few minutes of our conversation with someone that's 30 years old.
yeah.
And that's okay. It takes time to accumulate these things. You need the shots on goal and the experience base. So what that means, if you're the 30-year-old leader listening to this podcast today, I have not had the opportunity to have all those experiences yet. Find a mentor. Find
hmm
somebody that has, because then you can learn off their experience base. And believe me, if they are a legacy leader, they are wanting to see you become consciously competent much sooner in your leadership journey than likely he or she did.
That's great advice, actually, Dean. You know, just having that trusted mentor who can give you some guidance. And I suspect guidance would be particularly needed when, let's say, you have the dissent in the room, you have the conversation, people have come with divergent views, and you're converging, let's say, around an outcome. But how do you deal with the reluctant heroes? Let's say the people who don't really agree with what we've just agreed, if you know what I mean, because that's not unusual. You know, agreement in the room, and then people go out and do something that is contrary to what has been agreed. What are your thoughts around that? How do you deal with that?
Well, there's constructive and destructive dissent. And we're definitely talking about the constructive dissent here. And you want to have a rubric as the leader that keeps dissent from becoming destructive. A quote to think about here is, I don't believe healthy teams avoid friction, but they know how to use it. But you have to have a boundary around that because constructive dissent challenges the idea and yet protects the relationship. It says things like, I disagree, and here's why. Here's my evidence. Here's an alternative. Destructive dissent attacks the person, recruits factions, or treats disagreement as something that must be won in the moment. Then yeah, I think you have to look at what's the difference then? Well, the difference is the motive. Am I challenging this because I want a better outcome or because I actually want to win in this moment? I want to beat a peer,
Mm,
to look better than in this moment here in the leadership venue, my moment in the sun. I want to make a big me and a little you. So dissent isn't the same as inquiry. Help me understand is different from I disagree and here's why. Mature teams need to be capable of both, and there needs to be a psychological safety. And we often hear that term used, but it shouldn't mean freedom from discomfort. You can be safe
absolutely.
and still be discomforted. It should mean freedom to create a productive discomfort. That's actually what we're after. And I would often tell people you have to be comfortable being uncomfortable.
I think that's great, Dean. And I'm nodding furiously here when you're speaking because I think two things that are probably the most misunderstood concepts in management science as such is psychological safety and emotional intelligence or empathy, actually, where people think it's about just being nice. And how you've described it there, sort of the candid conversations, the ability to have the conversations in a way that respect is maintained, but you're not avoiding the issue. I mean, really, that's what we're talking about when we talk about psychological safety, isn't it?
It is. I think that sometimes we believe that you need to have a frictionless environment to feel safe. But that's not what that means. The leader has to set the tone for that, though, and realize that we may disagree, but it's not going to affect how I treat you. Now,
Mm-hmm.
it's easy to say that, but you have to live it out a few times for people to see that he really does mean that. And I think you have to introduce some things to where you're going to have some rules in the way you run a meeting, particularly when you want dissent to be brought up, because sometimes people will bring the dissent up and then it never gets resolved. So this is where I think there's a rubric to put in place that I call three rules and a clock that tends to limit this. So the three rules and a clock is very applicable. And if your listeners are note taking, this might be a point to get the pen back out. Number one, we will not always agree, but we will always align. Alignment and agreement are not the same things. And if you always are seeking agreement, you're going to be disappointed. But alignment you can get to. So that's point number one. Point number two of our three rules and a clock is debate has a beginning and an end. So you say, like, all right, we are going to start the dissent now, right? But it's not going to go on forever. And ideally, it's going to be bounded within that period of time for that meeting. You don't want it to be continual, never ending, or even interrupted. I think it's a continual process flow that needs to be bounded ideally within that time frame. And then thirdly, when debate ends, decide. You're
Mm.
not going to then come back and have it happen again. I had a leader once at AstraZeneca who we would have what I thought was alignment, and I would go out and execute. And then I'd come back and say, here's what I went and executed with my team, and we're out in the marketplace implementing this now. And he would say to me, well, I hadn't completed my thinking. And I would say, the marketplace doesn't wait for you to complete your thinking, right? So what was missing in that was this three rules and a clock. So there's the three rules. Well, what's the clock? Well, the clock is that it doesn't just go on forever. It's bounded because if you let it go on forever, The marketplace is going to decide for
Yeah.
you. You're going to miss opportunities. You're going to have misunderstandings, which then creates a dysfunctionality for the next time that you have to have a similar meeting. So who controls all that is the speed of the leader. The speed of the leader is always the speed of the team. So three rules and a clock can help teach a team that reaching a decision is great, but if the time's not right, the accountable leader decides. That's what I
Yeah.
would always tell my team too. Two people on a horse, only one can be in front. The person who's behind you on the horse has a great vantage point. And you,
Hmm.
as the person on the front of the horse here in this analogy, you need to listen. But there comes a point where, okay, if I disagree with what is being said to me after considering all of it, I still have to decide. So ideally, there's more of a come together with a collective decision. But there are times when reasonable people will not. But then it shifts to the accountable leader has to decide. And that's what I would always tell my teams is if we cannot have that together, I will have it alone.
Yeah, that I think that's super advice. And I've come across many teams, Dean, where that can often be the problem, where there's a sense that this is a democratic process right through to the very, very end. So that the decision has to be democratic. And when there's lots of dissent, you actually won't get to a decision if you put the democratic lens. So that point you're making, I hope lots of people are listening to that. And that sense of I'm the accountable person.
Exactly. And I think a relevant point here is Margaret Thatcher quote where she said consensus is the absence of leadership.
Hmm.
And that sounds like a polarizing absolute statement, which is
No, I know.
she meant it. Absolutely.
Yeah,
I think the business application is that there comes a time when someone has to decide, and it is that person
absolutely.
who's accountable. And if someone is above you on an org chart, they have that accountability. I have a boss, and I will tell him, I do not agree with what you just said, but unless it's illegal, immoral, or unethical, I will align because you are on the front of the horse and
Yeah.
you are accountable.
Yeah, it's a great phrase. I've heard you use that before, actually, and I've loved it. Now, Dean, you are writing a book. I'm extremely jealous of you and great admiration for anyone who writes books. So, congratulations on that, first of all. Really interesting title, How to Matter Forever. You're immortalizing yourself, it sounds. But I know one of the things that you talk about is legacy vectors. Tell us about the book. Tell us where it came from. What's it going to be about? Give us a flavour of it.
Sure, you mentioned 4 decades worth. That's a long time.
Mm,
And there's a lot of things that happen during all that time. And there comes a point in time as you do get older and reflect that you want to memorialize those things. I knew I could not do that on my own. So I went to a thought partner and I asked for some recommendations around, do you have someone that helps someone like me memorialize these things and put it into some collective institutional memory? For no other reason than I want that to be for perpetuity within my own family and within those close to me to say, what impact did he have during those 40 years of investment in others? And I got a recommendation to a great book writer. And so the big item here is go to someone who knows what they're doing, because
mm,
otherwise you just end up writing a book and sounding like you're just giving out a bunch of incoherent opinions. So I found that person in Martha Finney. She helps executives memorialize their lifetime of learnings, and it's a specialty that she has, and she's been great to work with, and she's helped me to put this book together. I wanted to call the book Moving at the Speed of the Market, which absolutely is the way that I think. I look at it as let's go faster. Can we get there quicker? Because I've worked in two organizations over the course of my working lifetime, and it's a continual observation is we sometimes get analysis paralysis. So I wanted to call it that. She looked back at me on a Zoom call one day and said, "That is not inspirational." And I thought, okay, tell me what is. And she said, you're trying to relay how the leadership philosophies that you've had have had an impact on people that's sustainable. Why don't you call it How to Matter Forever? And I said, that's really good. This is why I brought you in and gone in to get that expertise that can actually help me. So there is a philosophy though in it because a book about leadership is a dime a dozen. I mean, go on
Mm.
Amazon and put in book on leadership and you won't ever get to the end of all the things that would be available. So what I learned over the course of time, particularly where I led large teams of people, was that there had to be an approach. So I call it the legacy vector approach. And what I mean by that is take a set of vectors, an X and a Y vector. You have the Y going up, the X goes out. If I remember from some classes I didn't really pay a lot of attention to back in college. So you have to have two labels on that. Well, I put on my y-axis grow leaders. So what do I want to be known for? If I have a legacy vector, it's towards something because both of those lines go up and out to infinity. Well, I want to be growing leaders, but the x-axis, I want to be delivering results. So it kind of forces your leadership philosophy, what you're known for, into an X and a Y vector. So mine are grow leaders, deliver results. This is how I presented myself when I led large teams of people. I became known for these things. Why was that? Largely because that's what I talked about. When people would say, tell me what's the latest with you. Well, I'm still growing leaders and I'm delivering results. That's what I'm doing. And then I had leaders sent to me to grow because I was known for growing leaders. So there's a little bit of self-fulfilling prophecy that tends to happen. So I needed this rubric, but it's not just the X and the Y. There had to be a piece about what fuels you up and out on those two vectors. And that's where I became a strength finder devotee. I am all in about the Now Discover Your Strengths, the Clifton Strength Finder gives you 34 strengths across 4 themes. It really helps you if you are very declarative when you take the test. You don't pick middle of the road answers. You pick on binary, one or the other. It gives you back some really clear results. So for me, that's maximizer and activator and belief and responsibility and significance. I'm at my best when I'm starting something new. I'm making the most out of it. I believe in it. I'm responsible for it and I can do it at scale. That's those 5 strengths lived out. But against what? Against growing leaders and delivering results. So in my career too, these 10 years at Inizio, I have been mostly on that X axis of delivering results. I've had 10
Mm.
years of developing business in the pharma services industry, which was a great contrast to my first 30 years at AstraZeneca, which was largely growing leaders. And we would deliver the results through the growth of those leaders. Well, now here I am entering year 40 very soon of all this. And I start to look back and I think, well, to what end have I been doing all this? Well, because I want to establish things that are sustainable beyond me. And what that leads to then is I want to matter forever to someone. That
Hmm.
doesn't mean it's the same matter forever to each individual. It could be only one little aspect of something. But I want to leave people out of this book with a actual approach that they can take to how they can matter forever by deciding what they want to be known for. And notice nowhere in what I want to be known for did I mention any specific job title. I didn't mention CEO, I didn't mention CCO, CMO, name any 3-letter acronym that you want to about how you might describe yourself. That is a position trap. That's what you want to do, not what you want to be. And what I want people to come away from the How to Matter Forever book is an actual rubric across a lot of very important topics, much like we've talked about today, that says, I am going to establish something greater than myself, and I'm going to do it in a very concerted fashion that stops me from being the center of attention.
It sounds fantastic, and I'm really looking forward to reading it. And I've got this real sense, even from all my conversations with you, that this book, it's not going to be a theoretical treatise on leadership or anything like that. It's going to actually have some really practical pieces in it that people can take away in terms of what they need to do. Because even from today, just some of those tools, the 3 rules and a clock, all of those pieces are so practical. And even within different contexts, it doesn't really matter. You can still apply them, Dean. But listen, I'm really, really excited about the book. End of the year, we're looking at?
End of the year, the manuscript will be finished up in October. Then we'll move toward publication. I expect that it will be available in a variety of outlets by the end of the year, and looking forward to that happening. There will be very practical application-oriented content at the end of each chapter.
Excellent.
We're looking to make this a war and peace where you get to the end of it, you don't even remember what the book started about. It will be tight, concise, very much intentional to help people come away with it, not being the same. That's the goal, is they look at it
Mhm.
and it becomes a catalytic inflection point that allows them to say, I'm going to be different as a leader, and I'm going to have a sustainable approach to how to do that.
Sounds fantastic. Really looking forward to it, Dean. And that's probably a good point to end this conversation. It always feels terribly self indulgent because I always just enjoy these conversations for me. But I know there are listeners out there and there's lots of fantastic content that you've been taking us through there. So thank you very much for joining me for the 30th episode. Thank you for being my first guest as well, actually. And as I said, I always very much enjoy our conversations. And I look forward to the next one, Dean, because I'm absolutely sure there will be one.
Absolutely, and I will come back anytime. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. And I know for me, every conversation leaves me with something new to think about. So that you don't miss any of these episodes, you can subscribe to the Leadership Discoveries podcast. Do connect with me on LinkedIn or visit shirleykavanagh.com for more resources to help you reflect and support you in your own leadership journey. Until next time.